Hello everyone and welcome along to today's presentation where we're going to discuss player welfare and player well-being. So a quick introduction to myself. My name is Paul Gaffney and I'm an Academy Strength and Conditioning Coach with Armagh GAA. I've been working with Armagh GAA for the last 3.5 years and I'm currently working with the minor footballers and the senior hurlers. So today we're going to discuss what is player welfare, how we approach player welfare and how we monitor it and how we use it to benefit our players. So what is our aim as a player? So as a player, you want to be able to perform to the best of your ability week in and week out. You want to be available for selection each week and you want to stay injury free so you spend less time on the sidelines and more time playing the game that you love. So what is our aim as a manager? As a manager, you want to be able to ensure the welfare of all our players. You want to minimise the risk of injuries and you want to prepare our athletes for the physical demands of our sport. And you also want to ensure that our players reach their full potential. So what is player welfare? Player welfare is putting the player's physical and mental health first. We aim to provide a safe and risk-free environment where our players can excel. So as you see on the right hand side, your player welfare is basically your physically recovered, as your monitoring player load, monitoring player wellness, monitoring injury prevention, and making sure that our players are mentally recovered from bouts of exercise. So as a coach and as a player, we have to ask ourselves is how can we improve our player welfare? So one of these ways that we can improve player welfare is by monitoring player load. So player load is defined as training load is monitoring with the aim of making evidence-based decisions on appropriate loading schemes to reduce injuries and enhance team performance. Okay, so there's different ways that we can monitor training load. There's called acute workload, there's called a chronic workload, and there's acute chronic workload ratio. Okay, so we're going to go through these here in the slides coming next, but just a quick introduction to these terms is acute workload. This is typically the workload performed within 1 week. Okay, so this can be anything from your training sessions to your gym sessions to your games. So any exercise, bouts of exercise that you perform in 1 week, and typically 1 week, this is viewed as your acute workload. Okay, so this can also be an indicator of fatigue within our players. Chronic workload, this is typically the accumulation of acute workload over a 4-week period. Okay, so this is the training sessions, your gym sessions and your games over a 4-week period. So instead of a 1-week period, it's over a 4-week period. Okay, and this can be viewed as an indication of a player's fitness. So moving on from that, we've got the acute chronic workload ratio. Okay, so this is ratio and it is the greatest predictor of injury it's a greater predictor of injury than acute and chronic workload together. Okay, so we're going to discuss them in more depth as we go along. So how do we measure acute workload? So there's many different ways that we can measure acute workload, but perhaps one of the easiest ways to monitor it is by using internal load measures, which we can get by using the rate of perceived exertion, so the RPE scale, which you can see just down on the bottom left hand side of your screen. So it's basically on a scale of 1 to 10, how hard or how easy you find your training sessions. Okay, so if you found your training session really easy, you would give it maybe a 1 or a 2. If you found it really hard, you'd give it a 9 or a 10. So you just gauge yourself on how hard you found the session and you give it a rating from 1 to 10. So then from that there rating, if we have to multiply it by the time of our session, so say if we have a training session that lasts 75 minutes and I rated it on a RPE scale of 6, so I found it quite hard. So how we find out our acute workload is we time our 6 from our RPE scale multiplied by your 75 minutes, which gives you 450. So if you see on your right hand side, just down the right hand bottom screen, you can see a wee table with our acute workload. So I've just got your week planned out. So Monday we have nothing, so we have recovery. Tuesday we have a pitch session. Wednesday we have a gym session. Thursday we have another pitch session. Friday is a gym session, and then Sunday we have a game. So then up beside that there we have the duration of our sessions. So we have 75 minutes, 60 minutes, 60 minutes, 40 minutes, and then a 60-minute game. So on our RPE scale from our 1 to 10, our athlete found that on their Tuesday session was a 7 out of 10, Wednesday was a 7 out of 10, Thursday was a 5 out of 10, Friday was a 5 out of 10, and your Sunday, your game, was a 9 out of 10. Okay, so then obviously with times our session duration by your session RPE, and that'll give us your acute load on the right hand side. So then at the bottom we add that up. So our overall workload, our acute workload for that full week was 1,985, and then we're just going to divide that by 7, which is our week, which will give you 283.5. Okay, so that there, our acute workload for that week would be 283.5. So that's the simplest way of measuring your acute workload, and it's the easiest and most effective way. And if as a player, it's very easy to use, and as a coach and as a manager, it's a lot easier to use. There is other metrics which you can use, GPS data, heart rate data, but unfortunately not all of us have this available to us. So this is the cheapest and maybe the easiest way to monitor acute workload. So moving on into chronic workload, which remember was our 4-week period. So how do we measure our chronic workload? So similar enough to the way we would monitor your acute workload for your week. So you would have your weekly average. So our weekly average was 540 for the first week, 640 for the second week, 740 for the third week, 840 for the fourth week, 940 for the fifth week, 1,140 for the sixth week. Okay, so similar enough to this, but this time for the chronic workloads, which is our 4-week block period. So we're going to have 4 weeks data before we can find our chronic workload. Okay, so just as you see the wee calculation down on our left hand side is how do we measure chronic workload. So you add up week 1, week 2, week 3 and week 4 acute workload, and then you divide that by 4, which gives us a ratio of 690. Okay, so our first chronic workload on week 4 was 690. Okay, so again we're going to talk more about that here just in a wee second. So one of the most effective ways of predicting injury and checking to see our wellness of our athlete is using acute chronic workload ratios. Okay, so we're both using the calculations that we've used from our acute workload and our chronic workload, and now we're going to find out a ratio to try and predict injuries and prevent injuries with our players. So from this here we can use a simple calculation. So our first acute workload from week 4 was 840, and then we're going to divide that there by our chronic workload, which was 690, which gives us a ratio of 1.21. Okay, so that there's our ratio 1.21, and that there's a very important figure that we're going to find out what we use with that figure for in the next slide. Okay, so this is the ratio that will give you a good indication of our players' physical status. Okay, so if they're fully recovered for a game, if they're fully prepared for the demands of the game, and how we're going to perform throughout the game. All right. So just moving on from finding how we found our acute chronic workload ratios. So the research indicates that having our athletes in an acute chronic workload ratio of around 0.8 to 1.3 is considered the sweet spot, and it provides the lowest risk of injury. Okay, so you see on the graph just on the right hand side, just this is from work from Tim Gabbett. So that the green spot in the green block in the middle is considered your sweet spot. So that's where we want to train, and we want to have our athletes in that sweet spot. Okay, so that reduces the risk of injury. So again, that's from 0.8 to 1.3. So if we look back at our previous data, we can see that our acute chronic workload ratio for week 4 was 1.2, and then week 5 was 1.1, and week 6 was 1.16. Okay, so if you take that there 1.2 and we go to our graph down here on your right hand side, we see that 1.2 is still in that sweet spot, and we're still at reducing the risk of injury. Okay, so research from Tim Gabbett shown that if we spike our acute chronic workloads of ratios above 1.5, it's considered that you're going to increase the likelihood of injuring our players. Okay, so this is obviously what we want to try and avoid as players and as coaches, we don't want to get our players injured. We want to have them available for selection each week, which if we train them at over an acute chronic workload ratio of 1.5, they're going to be in that danger zone. Okay, so see the red block on your right hand side, you can see as it hits 1.5, the increase of risk of injury starts to increase. Okay, so that's what we want to try and avoid. So similarly enough, if we have an acute chronic workload of below 0.8, that's considered under training our athletes. Okay, and which again can increase the risk of injury. If our players aren't prepared to meet the physical demands of the game and they're underprepared, then as we see, if we go below 0.8, that their line starts to increase again and increase the risk of injury. So we want to avoid that as well. So we want to try and train our athletes in this sweet spot as much as we possibly can. Alright. So also by work with Tim Gabbett found that if we spike our training loads in week 1, it might not necessarily see the injury in that week 1 or week 2. It's research has shown that it could be possibly around week 3 or week 4 before we see the injury coming from that player. So it might not always, if you spike your training, so if we go out on a Monday or Tuesday and just go mad and train our players and our athletes as hard as we can for 2 weeks, we might not see an injury within that 2 weeks, but down the line, week 3, week 4 and week 5, we could potentially see our players starting to get injured and pick up wee niggles and sprains and stuff that might keep them away from performing to their highest ability. Okay, so it's just to be wary of that there. So spiking our training loads massively can still increase the risk of injury. So that's just a quick introduction into acute chronic workload ratios, and it's really simple tool on how to monitor our players. And as a player or yourselves, it's a real easy way to see how your physical status is going and how you're feeling, and to be more aware of how training sessions are feeling on your body. Okay, so it's just an easy wee tool to use and might be able to help us hopefully prevent risking injuries and keep us playing longer and less time on the physio bench. Okay, so another way to sort of monitor our player welfare is by measuring wellness. Okay, so a wellness questionnaire allows us to gain a wealth of vast, easy to process information of our athletes. Okay, so it's a simple way of trying to monitor how our athlete has slept that night before, how our athlete is stress levels, if they're feeling very stressed, if they're not feeling stressed at all, how their fatigue levels are, and their muscle soreness as well. Okay, so wellness data can quickly inform coaches and athletes of their physical and mental preparedness for their next bout of exercise. So if a player is flagged up on the wellness questionnaire, a coach or yourself as a player will be able to adjust their training schedule and possibly even decrease your training load so that individual player can appropriately recover and not risk themselves of injuries. Okay, so this is a very simple tool to use, and ideally you would want your players or yourself as a player or your athletes to fill this questionnaire in maybe as soon as they get up or maybe an hour after they get up in the morning times. Okay, so you want to find out how their sleep quality was. So they just rate themselves from 1 to 7, how they felt their sleep quality was, same with their stress levels, with their fatigue levels, and with their muscle soreness. Okay, so this can give your coach or yourself an indication if we have an athlete who comes in and flags up a 6 for sleep, so they got a very bad sleep. Their stress levels is maybe around a 4, their fatigue level is as a 6, and their muscle soreness is a 6. Okay, so if we have planned a very heavy training session for these players that night and we get this information from our wellness questionnaire and we see that this player is flagging up very high on 3 out of the 4 questions, then we can maybe pull that player aside, have a conversation with them, see what's going on, if they're feeling stressed or maybe something has happened that they didn't get any sleep that night or they're injured, that we'll be able to tailor their training workload, that we're not actually just pushing them and keep them going, which in turn is going to potentially risk their injury. Okay, so if they're not feeling fully recovered, maybe they're tight muscle soreness, and we go out and we expect them and push them on to do a heavy training session, we're massively spiking their training load because they're not properly recovered, and then potentially we're going to put them at risk of injuring themselves. Okay, So this just is a very simple and effective way of getting information about our players quick and easily. So moving on, some of the final words. So although it may be impossible to completely remove the risk of injury, but if we use these simple monitoring tools, we can go a long way in trying to reduce the likelihood of these injuries. After all, as a coach and as a player, we want all our players to be playing to the full of their potential, and we don't want to be playing fatigued and not properly recovered, so then we're restricting them from reaching their true potential. Okay? So thanks very much for listening. Hopefully it gave you a quick introduction into monitoring player load and player welfare. Okay, so acute workload, chronic workload, acute chronic ratios, and how we would monitor player wellness, and how we can bring this in to cater and to adjust our training sessions. Likewise, as a player, it's very easy to use these here yourselves to get into good habits of using these monitoring tools. That you can do this on yourself. If you don't feel that you're properly recovered, you can be responsible and maybe pull the coach to the side and have a word with them, saying, listen, I don't feel I'm properly recovered, and hopefully your coach will take that on board and adjust your training session. Okay, so again, thanks very much for tuning in. I know it was a very quick introduction into the training load and player welfare and player wellness, but if you have any more questions or you just want me to go over anything again, you can contact me on the 2 links above, and hopefully I'll be able to answer any questions I have for you. Okay, so thanks very much for tuning in, and see you all again soon.